Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a premier field engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion is focusing on modern management. Specifically, we're starting a series on enrollment in Intune. Today's part one, introducing the concept of enrollment. Actually, this part one, initially I was going to do a bit later in the series. I really tossed things back and forth because some of the things we're going to talk about in this session you might think would come after enrollment, but there's also a need to be aware of the things we're going to talk about before you ever enroll your first device. So I thought I would go ahead and move it to the front. And then after this, we'll start to get into the details about enrollment for specific operating systems and so on. Here's the agenda for our discussion, just basically going through what is enrollment, pretty easy topic. Talk about the supported devices that we can enroll in an Intune environment. Again, we're not going to talk about really much detail at all, no detail about those managed devices. We're going to spend the bulk of our time focused on what I call the basics. And there's several areas here that merit some discussion to understand what these are and understand the implications of configuring them ahead of time or not configuring ahead of time. So also, this session is not intended to be any more than an introduction. There are some things here that I will touch on, that I will go deeper into as we go further along in the series. And I'll probably mention those a couple of times as we go along. So what is enrollment? Really pretty simple, right? Enrollment is the process that will effectively attach a device to Intune. One of the key differences between Intune, which is a modern management solution, and traditional, more PC agent-based kind of management solutions is that you don't have any software that you need to install on the device that you're going to manage. When we think about installing software on the device that we need to manage, typically we think of Windows devices because we've had products like Configuration Manager for years that has effectively managed those devices. It does require in a Config Manager world to install the Config Manager client. And there are other management products that are similar in the way that, that we have to do these things. That is not true for Intune. Let me make sure I mention one tangent here, as we're going along. So if you look through some of the articles that are available for Intune, you can find them on the web. One of the things that you will see, perhaps, referenced is the idea of a PC management agent for Intune. That agent did exist, and it was used to manage Windows 7 and Windows XP devices when XP was supported. The Intune solution that you're going to see today, and if you're working with Intune, starting fresh with Intune today, there's no ability that you have to even manage devices with this legacy PC agent. Yes, there are some devices, some environments out there that still use the PC agent, but very, very few and far between. Intune is an MDM management solution, right? And that's where we really have the concept of attaching a device to Intune, enrolling the device in Intune. The point is that the MDM framework that is used to help manage those devices in the Windows world and also in the Apple and the Google ecosystems is built into the operating system. There's a small asterisk there with Google and with some of the differences in the Android platform that we'll get to whenever we focus on Android specifically. But that's what we're talking about here. Enrollment basically tells the operating system to attach to a given MDM management solution, in this case Intune, and that device becomes managed without any additional software being required on the system. I'll also go on one other tangent here. When we talk about enrollment, one of the items that we're going to reference, not really today, maybe I'll say it a few times, is the idea of what's called a company portal app. Well, I just said that you don't need any additional software on the device in order to manage it. That is an absolutely true statement. There's one, again, small asterisk that might apply to the to the Android ecosystem that we'll talk about when we get there. But as a general rule, there is no strict requirement to have any software on the device in order to manage it. You can put the company portal on the device, and that is something that you may or may not want to do depending on your management scenario. There is no requirement that the company portal be on the device in order for that device to be managed. Again, small asterisks around the Android ecosystem. So another way of saying it is the company portal on Windows, on iOS, does not supply any required management functionality to supplement what MDM on the OS already provides. Anyway, already getting a little bit too deep in the weeds there, so we'll save that for later discussion. All right, and basically the enrollment process also switches a device from being unmanaged to then being managed. Right. So what operating systems do we support? What kind of devices do we support? So with Microsoft, pretty much all of our operating systems these days, certainly Windows 8.1, the phone RT, the PC release for Windows 8.1, Surface Hub, pretty much all the Windows 10. I'm looking across here, I don't really see one that's missing, though it may not be every single one, but Windows 10 Home, S, Pro, Education, Enterprise, that covers pretty much all of it. Windows 10 Mobile, IoT, all of those, right? So really cool because that MDM framework is baked into the OS across all of these. It's available for management. It should be good to go, right? Windows 10 Mobile, yeah, see that. Apple. So we support devices that are running iOS 9 and forward. Mac OS, we support devices 10.11 and forward. Some interesting discussions around Mac that we might have as we get into Apple. For Google, it's Android 4.4 and forward, right? Now, there's a lot of discussion that we will have around each one of these, and that's why we will have a separate session for talking specifically about enrollment of Microsoft devices, enrollment of Apple devices, and enrolling Google devices, Google-based devices, Android, and so on. We'll get to that later. So let's jump right in. Get into what I'm calling the basics. And again, as we get into these, you may look at these and think, well, that's something I'll deal with later, after I've already configured my enrollment. And if you choose to do that, that's fine. But there are certain ones of these, maybe terms and conditions, that you might want to plan for ahead of time before you really start production enrolling various devices. So what is this thing called terms and conditions? So I'm going to pull in my Intune console, and we'll spend a lot of time going back and forth. All of what we're going to talk about is under device enrollment, really. And so here's the terms and conditions piece. So terms and conditions, this is something you have as an option that you can set up. The idea is that whenever you have a device where you are factoring the user into the management of that device, right? So another little tangent to say it, whenever you have devices that you want to manage, you may want to manage those devices just on their own. You may want to factor the user of the device into your management. That's great, right? You might want to do both, and that's great too. But if you do have the user in the focus for management, then you might want to present to them terms and conditions that they must agree to in order to continue forward, right? And in this case, again, the user interface that we have in the Intune world is called the company portal. So the user would launch the company portal, and they would see these pre-configured terms and conditions that they need to read and accept, right? These terms and conditions are items that you do deploy to users, not devices. So we have not really talked at all about how you go about deploying various items that you configure to your devices, to your users. Really, that process is called assigning the particular configuration to users or devices, and I'll show you the assignment node in various places as we go through. And then the user, in order to proceed, is going to have to accept the terms and conditions. Now, once the user does that once on a device, then they don't have to repeat it. In other words, if the user has 5 different devices, and the user goes to device 1 and says, okay, fine, I accept the terms and conditions, well, those terms and conditions are inferred to apply against all 5 devices because they're all being managed by Intune. So it's not going to force the user to re-accept on the second device when they go to it, right? Now, there is a way that when you modify the terms and conditions down the road, that you can actually trigger the user to have to accept them again. Let me show it to you because it's easier to probably see it. So if I go into terms and conditions, I have 2 that are configured. I've got one with a funny name, untrusted terms and conditions perhaps, and then I have a standard terms and conditions, right? They are both assigned. So I'm going to go into this particular terms and conditions, and notice the assignment node on the left. I can configure the terms and conditions all day, but until I actually assign it, it's not going to do anything, right? So if I go into the properties of my terms and conditions, here is the name of my terms and condition. Now, this is not what the user sees. This is what you see in Intune. And then if I go to the configuration, here's the title, and then the particular summary of terms and the specific text of the terms and conditions, and so on. Notice the current version. So if I go update this, I don't know, as soon as humanly possible, right? And then I save it, I can require the user to again accept those terms and conditions before they can use the device again. But I've already deployed these, and so let's go actually look at a Windows 10 device in this case. I'm going to pull that in. And I do have the company portal on here, so let me go find the company portal. Come on. All right. Company portal. Here we go. And so if I click on that, you'll see that I actually show I'm signing in. I've already logged into this device, so it knows who I am, and it's displaying to me, hey, here's your terms and conditions, and again, trying to be funny, we really, really don't trust you. You must agree to these terms. And then a second one that's more realistic that you can do. I sent out 2 terms and conditions on purpose just to illustrate the fact that you could, if you need to, set multiple terms, right? So whenever you configure these, along with all of the other things that we will talk about today and in general settings that you'll configure in Intune along the way, factor in who you're actually going to deploy these to. If you have a user that is assigned more than one terms and condition policy, then they will show up here and you will need to accept all or so on, right? So I can go into here, read the terms, great, I'm good, sounds good, okay, I'm going to go ahead and accept those, accept all, and now great. So Intune records that, I'm into the company portal, and off I go, right? Now, so if I go back to Intune, may not be there quite yet, but acceptance reporting loading up, and so you'll see, hey, I actually have accepted this particular terms and condition, and this one happened in the past, so the new one hasn't quite made it here yet. That should show up over here in a minute, but you still see, you can track the users in your environment and so on, and whether they accept, what the time is, and so on, right? So terms and conditions, interesting thing to be able to bring to bear, and again, something to plan for as you're considering enrollment. Okay, similarly, enrollment restrictions. So let's pull back in the Intune console, and we'll focus now, just kind of going one by one, we'll focus now on enrollment restrictions, which is next. So first thing, the ability to have restrictions on enrollment might be perceived as a security feature. It's not intended that way. It's just to give you some controls over the kind of enrollments that can happen in your environment. So be aware that it's not strictly a security feature, but it's just something there to help you. There are a couple of different options that you can specify through the enrollment conditions. So for example, if you have users that carry around 10 devices on their belt day to day, they may want to manage all 10 of them, right? Whereas there may be other groups of users that have just 1 or maybe 2 devices. So you can kind of figure out, okay, based on what group a user is in, they may have a need to enroll more devices in Intune. And this other group may not need more than a couple. So it just helps you put some limits on who can enroll what in terms of number of devices. The other thing that you can do is specify the platforms of devices, the OSs, that you will allow to enroll. The big umbrella, Android, iOS, Windows. But even beyond that, you can drill in and for certain operating systems, specify the particular version information that you want to allow. So let's go look at that. So if I go into enrollment restrictions, you see that I can go create the restriction. I've actually got a couple created. The default one will be there, right? And this is the name. So all users is actually a group that you can create. And so whenever you first take a glance at this, it may look like, oh, this is just being assigned to the all users group. No, it's named all users. Right? You see that because the other one that I did create, this one I created manually, I called it test. This one I created and called it demo restriction, right? So if I go into this one, I will see the ability to assign, and I have not assigned it to anyone yet. So that, don't be confused by the way that displays. The other thing, notice, is the priority. So the idea of the priority, if you have multiple conditions that you assign out to your environment, it could be that a given user would receive more than one enrollment restriction. When that happens, the enrollment restriction with the highest priority wins, okay? Now, what can you do with these enrollment restrictions? Let's start with device type. So if I go into the device type restriction, and I've already selected that, so let me go back to the right. Come on, mouse, there we go. And then I look at properties. So I can look at properties basically as wanting me to go to either platforms or platforms configuration. So this is where I can allow or block certain types of enrollment. So you see I'm allowing Android, but I'm blocking Android for work. I'm going to go ahead and allow Android for work. I'm allowing iOS and macOS, and I'm allowing Windows MDM. So this is the Windows bucket is for 8.1 and 10, right? All right. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then also for platforms configurations, I can drill in a bit deeper. If I have an Android or Android for Work device or iOS device, then I can specify the minimum and maximum OS versions. So it could be you want to allow Android, but maybe you just don't like what was offered in the earlier versions of Android, as an example, and you want to say, well, I'm not going to allow Android 4.4. Yes, Intune supports it, but we're going to go forward and choose a more recent version of Android as the minimum, and then maybe I'm not ready to support the latest version of Android, so I'm not going to quite allow that into the system yet. Again, your choice. You can set whatever makes sense. And then Windows MDM, again, if you want to do that, fine, but we don't support the restrictions, so there you go, right? And then finally, for device limit restrictions, you can set up to 15 devices that a user can have and enroll at the same time. So I put myself always at 15 because I'm always using the same user account in my lab to do different enrollments, and I don't want to run out, right? Or hit the limit. But in practice, probably not everyone in your org needs to have the ability to enroll 15 devices. If there's someone that is testing Intune and its capabilities, yeah, absolutely, sure, they'll have the need to do that. But a standard user likely will be somewhat less. So completely up to you how you decide to do that. I will also kind of put a mental asterisk here because we're going to come back. I'm mentioning here that for a user, you can set up to 15 devices they can enroll. That is true. There is one configuration where you can exceed the 15 device limit, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the session. All right. All right, so that's talking about enrollment restrictions. Let me pull Intune out again and move on to the next screen. Device categories. So this one is interesting. So whenever you enroll a device, so I showed you the company portal, right? This is kind of tiptoeing across that discussion where we will kind of pull back the covers more so on the details of enrollment. But suffice it to say right now, there are two ways that you can enroll a device. One is manually, and then the other big umbrella category is to have some automatic device enrollment that happens. More details to come, right? The manual method for enrolling a device on iOS and Android is by installing the company portal and working through the enrollment registration wizard on the company portal. Again, company portal is an absolute not required thing to provide full MDM management of a device. Again, small asterisks on Android we'll get to. But if you do want to factor the user in and have the user be able to interact with what Intune provides, it is necessary, right? So that's where the manual workflow to have the device enrolled by the user is present with iOS and Android. In Windows, instead of using Company Portal to register to enroll the device manually, you would use Settings. And then you could launch the Company Portal and you would be asked the question about what category the device is in. So bring it all together. Whether you're iOS, Android, or Windows, when you enroll a device, when you open the Company Portal the first time, you're going to be asked, okay, what category should this device be assigned to, right? Now, if you want to enroll the device automatically, you can still use categories. It's just a convenient thing whenever the user does it manually to pop it up and let them decide, oh, this is a sales device, or this is an IT device, or this is a marketing device, or this is a device in Europe or the US, or whatever your categories are going to be, right? So ultimately, categories can be thought of maybe as just a label, but they are not just a label, right? So let's go into this a little bit more. So here's device categories. If I go into device categories, you see that I have 3 set up. I can go create whatever I want. It's just literally a factor of giving it a name, description, and creating it and saving it. And then we have just that label that has been added. But assigning the user or the device to a device category can be really, really important, right? Let me kind of take a few leaps ahead and kind of explain this. One of the ways that you can, let's focus on Windows for a minute. And there can be multiple examples, other OSs I could bring in here too as well, but let's just focus on Windows. So one of the ways that you can automate the process of getting a Windows 10 device managed and built is to use this thing called autopilot, right? Well, whenever you run a PC through the autopilot process to get it joined to Intune and built, one of the things that happens is that you want certain apps, certain policies, certain different things to start to apply to the device pretty quickly. Another way of saying that is there's going to be common things that you need as an organization to make sure all of these different Windows 10 devices are complying with, right? Now, after that's done, there might be other things that need to be loaded onto the device, but now there's a difference between sales, between marketing, between IT, between whatever your categories might be, right? So, and I'm going to say this, and I know I'm not drilling into this deeply enough to really kind of turn over all the stones about it, but I'll show you this and then we can talk about it more later. So one of the useful things about device categories, and again, kind of jumping ahead, is that we can, come on, move over. Okay, let me refresh for a moment. That's interesting. All right, so let's go back. All right, cool. So we have, well, let's go back this way, sorry. Groups, right? So we haven't talked about groups yet. We're not going to talk about groups that much in this session, but just to illustrate this. So if I go into groups, for those coming from a config manager world, groups are the equivalent to collections. They are definitely not the same as collections, but same kind of concept. You want to build groups and put either devices and users in groups. You don't want to put both devices and users in groups, but you can build groups for devices, build groups for users, and populate them, right? So you saw that I had 3 sample categories: marketing, sales, and IT. Well, if I scroll down in my group lists, I have marketing group, IT group, sales group, right? So I can use these groups to say, okay, give me all of the devices that are in the IT category. Give me all of the devices that are in the sales category. Give me all of the devices that are in the marketing category. And then what I could do in Intune is go back to that autopilot experience. You might have all of your configurations that are needed by all of the systems targeted to, as an example, all devices. You might want to do that, right? Because when you add a new device through autopilot, the first place it's going to show up is all devices. Just like when you do it with Config Manager, the first place it shows up is all systems, right? So you might target your deployments to all devices just to make sure you have that consistency. But you certainly won't want to deploy every single thing to all devices, right? This is, again, just an example scenario. So once we have all the configurations targeted here, there may be supplemental configurations you want to target to specific categories of devices here, right? So if I look at this group, let me just look at the properties of the group. I can go look at how I'm crafting the membership. And in this case, I'm actually using what's called a dynamic rule. Again, not digging deeply into this. And what I'm doing is saying, okay, I need the device category to equal IT. And so what happens is this group will refresh, and if a device now has a category of IT, it will get removed or get added to this group. If the category is changed and it's no longer an IT device, great, it will get removed from this group, right? So you kind of see the parallel with collections and so on. So categories can be very, very useful in things that you might want to set up ahead of time on devices. What about the name? Right? Now this one's an interesting one because I will say up front, the point of this discussion is absolutely not to tell you how to solve this problem, but it is to make you aware of the problem and start you thinking about the problem, right? So especially whenever we're coming from a PC-centric management mindset, for those coming from Config Manager again, or other PC management kind of experiences, one of the key attributes, in fact, the key attribute that is used in a Config Manager environment to identify systems and understand where they are, who owns them, etc., is the name of that system. There's a lot of work that's gone into building naming conventions in a lot of different organizations. Well, think about devices. The device names are kind of difficult to interpret sometimes, right? So let me give you an example of that. Let me pull back in the Intune console. So if I go down to my device area, or up in this case, here's all my devices, right? So I can list all my devices, and what I see here is a nice kind of clean list. Again, it's my lab, so it's not very busy. So I know what these are by name, and it's really clean. Here's my iPad. I named my iPad. That's not the default name, right? And this is my Android device that comes in with the username of that device _Android for work. And that's fine. I can easily parse this out. But what about a scenario where you have thousands of devices here and you have users that have 8 different devices, right? 8 different Android for work devices, right? And then what about the default way Windows names itself, right? So these names are the way they are because I changed them, right? Let me go over here. So this is legacy stuff, but if I go over to the device actions, it's kind of historical actions that have happened on devices in my lab. This is the format of the name for a Windows 10 device unless you change it, right? So imagine getting hundreds or thousands of machines in your environment with this kind of formatting for the name, right? So again, I am not proposing that managing devices by name is the right way for a given organization. It may be, it may not be, right? But it is something that we need to think about, because if we're not going to use the name for management, then we're going to have to figure out some other attribute, right? And there are other attributes you can use, such as IMEI number, or in some cases serial number, or maybe other things, right? You may think, oh, well, I'll just use the username. Well, that's great, except what if, again, you have a user that has 15 devices? Well, at least you might say, I'll know who the user is, I can contact them and know that's who the owner of the device is. Well, yeah. But what about if you're not managing the device? What if you're not factoring the user into management? You're rather managing the device. There's a particular kind of user that I will tell you about in a minute, that under that user account, you're able to enroll 1,000 or more, depending on configuration, devices. So that would become unwieldy very quickly, right? Because that username is really not a real user. It's kind of like a service account. Again, more on that in a minute. So however we do it, right, you need to think through this and figure it out. Here's another consideration. So we'll get to this, I think, next, but there's the concept of, in device management, the idea of a personally owned device, BYOD, bring your own device, and a corporate owned device. If the devices that you're managing are corporate owned, then change their names at will. However you want to do it, that's great. They're your device. Name them whatever. But if it's a personally owned device, that's a different proposition, because it's not your device to change the name of, right? And so again, factor in the scenarios that you need to deal with, how you need to work with this, and it will be unique to your needs, to your organization, and so on, right? Okay. So let me show you this. Well, and one other thing too, before I show you. Well, I'm kind of showing you, so we'll talk about this. So one of the reasons that you might want to do this ahead of time, right? Let's say that I have, my device is all nicely named right now, right? But maybe when I initially enrolled the device, it's named like this, okay? So you think, okay, great, yeah, we missed that one. I'm going to go out and I'm going to change the name of that, right? Whether it's a script, whether it's some other way, right? And you do that, and then you come back in and look at all devices and you find out, oh, yeah, the name hasn't changed, right? Why hasn't the name changed? There's got to be something wrong here. Well, the answer is no, it's not wrong, right? But there are certain things that trigger in Intune on certain cycles that you have no control over. And this is one of them. So for those, again, coming from a config manager environment, you have the concept of discovery data and inventory data. You have similar concepts in Intune. The name of the device is something that comes in through inventory data. And so whenever you change the name of the device, it's going to take up to a week for that to actually show up in the console with the new name, right? No way you can trigger that faster. It's just a cycle that is out there, at least today. There may be an update at some point coming that I'm not aware of, where you can make that happen faster. But for now, it's once every 7 days. So that's not a showstopper. It does work, but it's a delay that you will take and have to work with up to 7 days. Right? You may get lucky and it may change that same day, but it could be up to 7 days. Right? So let me also show you. Let's see. Let me show you. So I'm going to go into the properties of this. So there's another thing too. So if I look at hardware, right, there is the name of the machine, but then there's also the management name. So this one might be something that you want to change instead of that one, right? Maybe, right? So if I go into, that's a Windows device. If I go into an iOS device, there's also, here we go. There's also a management name, right? So maybe that's what you want to use. Again, don't know, just raise the issue for you to consider. All right? All right, let's pull that out and move on to the next topic then. So kind of breached this already with the previous topic, but let's talk about it more specifically. The idea of a personal-owned device versus a corporate-owned device. If you're an organization where there are users that are wanting to leverage their own device for management, then understand Intune, the MDM capabilities in that device, whether it's Windows, iOS, Android, will do a really good job of helping segment that device and kind of put fences up on that device so that any personally owned data on that device will be obscured from being able to be seen and managed in Intune or any other management solution, right? Whereas if it's a corporate-owned device, you own the device and you're going to be able to see everything. So one of the implications here, and we'll get to this one in a minute, you need to figure out how you expect to manage these devices. Are you going to just manage corporate-owned devices? Are you going to manage just personally owned devices? Understand what data is available between the two if you have to manage both, right? Understand what the implications are of various enrollment methods, but that will end up having devices come in as personal-owned, as corporate-owned. Again, we'll talk about those a bit more later, right? But ultimately, when you enroll a device, if it is a personally owned device, then we are going to, again, separate the corporate and user data. So if you look in application inventory, for example, on a personally owned device, you're not going to see everything. Only the items that have been actually put onto that device by Intune will you see, right? Same thing, there's going to be differences with maybe inventory, other things, kind of thing. So again, but if it's corporate full access. Let me show you this in the console as an example. So still on the devices, this one is one that's corporate. Oh, by the way, notice this column, ownership. This is not a default column. You can add that column all day, no problem. If you need to, there's other columns you can put in here depending on what you need to see. Ownership is one that I chose, but you don't have to have that, or it's not there by default, I should say. So I know that these two are corporate owned. This one is personal owned. So if I go into this personally owned device and look at it, I see different details about it, right? It is personally owned. If I look at the properties, I can tell it is personally owned and it's not assigned to a category. So if I need to change the category, I can do that here, kind of on a one-off manually here. If I need to change the ownership, then I can do that here as well. But this is personal owned, so what does that mean? I'll just go to this example. When I go to discovered apps, I don't see anything. But this is a standard Windows 10 load. So I know there is a lot of stuff on this particular device just as a part of a Windows 10 standard load. But I don't see it because this is flagged as a personally owned device. Whereas if I go over to corporate owned, I will again see corporate owned. I can go now to discovered apps, and guess what? I'm going to see every single thing that's on that device, right? Because it's corporate owned. There's nothing that needs to be obscured from management in that case. Right? Okay. Keep going. So also, there's this idea of corporate device identifiers. So kind of sticking with the concept of corporate versus personal owned. Right? You may want to support the ability of a user to manually enroll their device. That may be something you instruct your users to do. Or it could be that you use a different enrollment protocol. So I'll just pull one and think in the iOS world, there's Apple DEP, the device enrollment program. If you enroll a device through the Apple device enrollment program, it will show up in Intune always as corporate managed because you cannot enroll a device through DEP unless you're a corporation doing that, right? So think about the scenario where you have a user with a device that they've enrolled as corporate owned, right? And then maybe they're talking to someone in the help desk or whatever, and they guide them through the process. Okay, let's unenroll your device. and let's re-enroll it. And so they walk them through unenrolling and then say, go ahead and load the company portal. We'll step through the enrollment manually. They go through that. Well, guess what? Now, because they've actually run through the company portal for the enrollment, it's now seen as a personally owned device, right? Or potentially, right? So you may not want that. You may want to say, yeah, okay, I understand those help desk actions could happen, but look, Intune, if you see certain identifiers ever show up in the environment, just know that regardless of how they were enrolled, they are corporate owned, right? So whether the user does it through the company portal or any other mechanism, they are corporate owned, and flag them and treat them as such, right? So let's look at that. Let's look at that specifically. So if I come back in with the Intune console, scroll down a little bit here. Actually, scroll up so I can scroll down. Device enrollment, and then enrollment corporate identifiers. Right? So what I have is the ability to add identifiers. So there's two ways I can do it. First is the IMEI number. This is applicable to all platforms, iOS, macOS, Windows, Android, all of them, right? So I can take the IMEI and figure out what that is, build a CSV file with the information, and then just keep updating that, and then go ahead and upload it into Intune, and I will have those values. I can also use serial numbers. Been seeing a lot of comment recently on a particular thread about Android serial numbers not necessarily being unique, so it could be some interesting things there. But you have both, right? If you do want to use serial numbers, that is specifically for these platforms. The Windows world does not support that. But whichever, once you have that crafted, you can go ahead and import from a file. So I'm going to go ahead and find my import file on the desktop. Sorry, here, CSV. Well, I can type. In desktop. Interesting. Where is it? Hang on a minute. Oh, I see. Because it's on GIF down here. That's why. One moment. All files. There we go. So demo csv.csv. It is an Excel sheet. What I'm going to do is just open it in Notepad real quick to show it. And it's really simple. It's just this file, and it has the actual IMEI number, and then you can provide device details if you want to. I'm just using the string device details. So all I'm going to do is open this and add it. And so Intune imports it, adds it, no problem. So I come over here and refresh, and now I have the device details, I have the IMEI number, when it was added, et cetera, et cetera. So now if devices with either of these two identifiers show up in Intune, we're going to treat them as corporate owned, right? So a nice thing to be able to kind of use. And one of the ways you may think, well, how am I going to go get the IMEI number, right? Well, if you have existing devices in your environment, then you can go into Intune and pull that information with a PowerShell script with the Graph API. There's a couple of different ways to do it. If you don't know what those numbers are, then again, you can kind of start to seed things with maybe a program like AppleDef or so on. So again, a little bit beyond the discussion here, but there are multiple ways that you can actually get into that and plan for it and so on. But that's what we are talking about whenever we are talking about corporate device identifiers, right? Okay. And then the last topic of the discussion, actually, maybe there's one more. Anyway, the concept of a device enrollment manager, right? So the device enrollment manager, I told you, as we were getting into this, I was talking about the device restrictions and a limit of 15, the limit of 15 devices assigned to a single user. I mentioned there was an exception to that. The exception is the concept of the device enrollment manager. So the device enrollment manager, basically, again, think of this as a service account. So particularly if you are planning to manage the device and you don't really care who the user is on the device, you just want to manage the device, then the device enrollment manager may be an interesting option for you, right? So a scenario for this, consider retail stores maybe, right? Where you have varying people showing up each day to work perhaps, and they show up at different times perhaps, and so they would walk in, maybe go get a device that they're going to use during the business day. It may not be the same device from day to day. So, maybe shared devices are very commonly used, right? So really, you might care more about the device itself versus the user on that device in that scenario. And there could be other scenarios as well. So what you might want to do is actually be able to enroll many devices with one user account. And that's what the device enrollment manager is all about. So if I go over to my device enrollment managers down here, I don't have any accounts in Intune, but it's a really simple matter. I can go add the account all day long. And so again, think of this account as a service account. And so you would just add this account here. And then whenever you go to manually enroll a device, you just use that username. So instead of Sarah or Steve at whateverorganization.com, it would be device enrollment manager 1 at whateverorganization.com, maybe as an example, right? And so by doing that, each device enrollment manager account can enroll up to 1,000 devices. Or there are some switches that you can throw, one in particular in Azure Active Directory, to say no limit on enrollment at all, as much enrollment as you need. Now be careful about this, right? Because if you change course later and decide to factor the user into management, then you're probably going to need to rework some things, right? Because the experience of using the device enrollment manager account and then trying to deploy to groups where that's a valid user kind of gets a little bit sticky, right? So be careful with that and just know that, but it is absolutely possible. And then the last thing here that we'll talk about is the concept of multi-factor authentication. And this really isn't an Intune thing so much. It requires Azure AD P1 or better. That's where it's implemented. If you do implement multi-factor authentication, then Intune will support that. So whenever you actually go and open up and sign into the company portal, then you'll be asked for 2 forms of identification or however you configure it, right? So that's really all I have to say on that. And so again, things that you should be maybe thinking about whenever you're setting up and getting ready for enrollment. Wanted to just cover those here. So we'll wrap the session today on that, and then we will continue on in this series and start to really drill into device-specific enrollment kind of discussions next. See you next time.